Hello, my name is Gavin, this is Genre Books, and this is the first in an intermittent video series called 50 Zanes of Grey, where I will be reading 50 books, probably more than 50, but at least 50 books by Pearl Zane Grey, the original, literature's original frontier dentist. I'm new to Westerns, relatively new to Westerns, and I think I can blame BookTube for inculcating this interest. It was in 2023, before I had the BookTube channel, that I first experienced June on the Range. This is Michael K. Vaughan's Western event, and one of the prompts was to read a Zane Grey book. So I did. I read Fighting Caravans, and yeah, I think I was hooked from that point. There were other Westerns that I read, and I enjoyed those as well. But the Fighting Caravans, I think, really, that really took me. Fast forward to the summer of 2024, and in one of my rare attempts at efficiency, I decided to try and kill two birds with one stone. There were multiple reading events happening. We have June on the Range, but we also have Summer of Sport. So I read another Zane Grey book. I read The Shortstop, which is not a Western, but one of his baseball novels, and I think I probably enjoyed that even more than Fighting Caravans. So I decided I really do like Zane Grey. The Shortstop was one of 4 novels that I read last year about baseball. So I've now read 3 more novels about baseball than I've watched baseball games. Naturally, the next step was to go completely overboard and decide I'm going to read a lot of more of Zane Grey. Usually all it takes is a stupid pun title to get me to that point. So the 50 Zanes of Grey seemed to fit. But that's fine. There's going to be Westerns. There's going to be sport. There's going to be adventure, travel. Unfortunately, there's probably going to be some fishing along the way. But we can gloss over that when the time comes. But this first video is about 3. So the first of 3 books from the 50. This is the Ohio River Trilogy. This is comprised of Betty Zane, The Spirit of the Border, and The Last Trail. These are not Westerns as you'd expect to see a Western. Like the first few Sackett books from Louis L'Amour, the frontier at this point is not in the Wild West. At the beginning of this trilogy, the USA is not even a sovereign nation. The Declaration of Independence has been signed, but the war has not yet concluded. By the time we get to The Last Trail, we are now looking back at the Revolutionary War. Doesn't stop there still being some renegade Englishmen running around, always a good handy villain, but the nation is brand new, and that's exactly the feeling that these books give to you. This is not a land of mesa and tumbleweeds and one-horse towns. This is log cabins. This is wooden forts. This is lush forests and rivers. The area in which the books are set is the east of Ohio State, and it's easy to spot the place because it's called Zanesville. So this is an American city, I'd call it a town, but I think Americans call it a city, that's named after the Zane Grey family. It's interesting to think that if Zane Grey hadn't have had ancestors so intimately involved with the forging of this frontier, whether he'd have been prompted to write these 3 books and following that the rest of the books, or whether he might have just stuck to the dentistry. Luckily enough, he did write the books, and we start with Betty Zane, written in 1903. Now, Betty Zane, Elizabeth Zane, is Zane Grey's great-grandmother, and she is famous outside of the book. There is a heroic act she performed in the defence of Fort Henry, where she made a dash to go and get some gunpowder, because in the book the gunpowder has been pilfered by the dastardly English. But we are introduced in this book to the wider Zane family and other characters around the Fort Henry settlement. Ebenezer, or Eb Zane, Colonel Zane, is the nominative leader of the area. He was the first, or one of the first people to settle in this area, and as an elder, for want of a better word, his opinion has great sway. He's obviously military in bearing as well. The book doesn't go into his military history too much. I don't know quite how much he fought for the British before the American Revolution. Maybe that's one to look for in some history later. But we are really dealing with his activity on the frontier. He has brothers. There is Silas, there is Jonathan. He has his youngest sister, Betty. He has his wife, Bess. And there are a slew of other characters. Jonathan features prominently in the trilogy. Silas, less so. There is also another brother, Isaac, who has been kidnapped by one of the local Native American tribes. I'm going to use the term Indian interchangeably here, purely because I'm going to end up quoting the book at some point, and that is the term used. There is going to be a problem with Zane Grey. We'll come to that when we do come to that, but I'm not going to use savage, which is a word he often employs. The events in this book are grounded in reality, but they have been heavily romanticized, and less palatable elements judiciously excised. Not that there doesn't end up being some fairly terrible behaviour included in the later books. The first one is possibly the most sanitised of the lot. We are talking in terms of straightforward heroism from Betty, from Jonathan, from Colonel Zane, Eb, and from someone who will become one of the main characters in the book, Lewis Wetzel, Lou, mostly just called Wetzel. Across the 3 books, he is the character who embodies more than any other the link between the frontiersman and the land. During this book, the Revolutionary War is still ongoing, and an unholy alliance of ne'er-do-well frontier criminals, Native Americans, and dastardly English troops are laying siege to Fort Henry. This happens in the third act of the book. This you can see the tensions rising throughout the novel. And when it finally does come to it, the battle is fairly bloody and visceral. There are lots of heavily romanticized depictions of heroism, moments of pathos, and then grit and determination. There are also moments of pure savagery. Most of these are supplied by Wetzel, who is just a preternaturally powerful and savage fighter. The villains mostly are cardboard cutout. Zane Grey is interesting in talking about Native Americans. There is a little more nuance here, but not an awful lot. I struggle to say it's nuance. Sometimes I think it's a little bit of cakeism, by which I mean he does really want to eat his cake and to have it too. He says the right things sometimes. He has his characters say the right things sometimes, but he will drift back into fairly lazy stereotypes about Native Americans. This is going to be something that is going to crop up in a number of these videos, and let's face it, this is probably the number one reason the Western genre is not as popular as it once was. The depictions of some of the tribesmen is reductive, simplistic, very critical at times. In Wetzel, we have a character who lives to basically kill as many Native Americans as he can. He is doing this purely through vengeance because they have killed his entire family. But here we have a character where certainly in this first book there is no space for nuance. There is no space for any flexibility or mercy, whatever you want to call it. That does change a little bit later. But when I talk about Zane Grey's cakeism, it's because he is at pains to comment at certain points in the book that the grievances of Native Americans are valid, and that the behaviour of the frontiersmen and of the governments as well has been terrible. Zane Grey also doesn't shy away from the moments of savagery and violence committed by the white characters. Often there will be English or French Canadian, so he does, even at these points, half absolve true Americans. Early on in Betty Zane, Colonel Zane says, "The Indians have their wrongs. I sympathise with them in many ways. We have robbed them, broken faith with them, and have not lived up to the treaties." There's also further passages later, and this one more authorial than a character's voice, but many white men in those days loved the Indian life so well that they left the settlements and lived with the Indians. Boone, who knew the Indian nature, said the honesty and simplicity of the Indian were remarkable. Kenton said he had been happy among the Indians. Colonel Zane had many Indian friends. Isaac Zane, who lived most of his life with the Wyandottes, said the American red man had been wrongfully judged a bloodthirsty savage, an ignorant, thieving wretch, capable of not one virtue. And then on the following page says, if we wish to find the highest type of the American Indian, we must look for him before he was driven west by the land-seeking pioneer and before he was degraded by the rum-selling French trader. So still managing to blame other people than the Americans who he wants to buy this book. Later on, in The Spirit of the Border, Colonel Zane again tries to explain the behaviour of the Native Americans, but also make sure that there is a good excuse for his behaviour and that of his family. When I came out here 12 years ago, the Indians were peaceable. If the pioneers had paid for land as I had paid corn planter, there never would have been a border war. But no, the settlers must grasp every acre they could. I am not going to solve the issues presented by a number of Westerns in this video. I think it's worth talking about and continuing to talk about and try to contextualize things. But on the face of it, as much as Zane Grey sometimes tries to exculpate the white man, he does lapse into some lazy stereotypes in matters of race, undoubtedly. Getting the language to talk about this is difficult, and I try to choose words carefully. I think if there is one line in this trilogy of books that encapsulates the problems of the context of the time, it is one that happens, I think, is near the end of Betty Zane. If not, it's near the beginning of The Spirit of the Border. The Zanes have servants. The servants are black. Now, they take pains to tell us these are not slaves. In fact, the black servant is very critical of a man from the south and calls him southern trash because they do have slaves there. But what the servant does is hides a love letter from this southern white gentleman to Betty Zane. And there is a misunderstanding that goes on for months on the back of that letter, which has been held back. Colonel Zane, in a fit of pique, says, "I'll kill that damn N-word if he didn't deliver that letter." In this edition from 1903, the word damn has been censored out. The N-word has not. This is how times have changed in one sentence. The fact that that little interlude is based around fairly standard plot devices of mislaid love letters does give a window to the other side of the Ohio River Trilogy. There is a surprising amount of romance involved. And this does follow well-worn romantic travails. The man and the woman might not see eye to eye to begin with, but grow to love each other. We have more than one instance in these books where there are competing suitors for the hands of the most eligible ladies of the frontier. What we also have, which we don't often have in many other romance novels, is they have an alarming tendency to get kidnapped. Sometimes these girls are kidnapped by white horse thieves and ne'er-do-wells. Sometimes they've been kidnapped by Native Americans. Sometimes young men are also captured by Native Americans and fall in love with the Indian princesses, or have the princesses fall in love with them and make sacrifice to save them. Sometimes the women who are taken are rescued. Wetzel heroically comes to their defense and saves them. Sometimes they are just killed. They are starved, beaten, assaulted. It's fairly unflinching, and there are sometimes some dramatic turns from a mannered frontier romance to savage happenings. The Spirit of the Border continues pretty much where Betty Zane left off. And Wetzel, as a character, comes much more to the fore. He's been there as a brooding presence in Betty Zane. In fact, he was almost the object of Betty Zane's affections. But he is aloof from that. He is above that. Not entirely immune, but determined single-mindedly in his quest as a frontiersman, and doesn't think that romantic attachments have any room in that scheme. The main antagonists in this book are the Gertie brothers, Simon and Jim, who are back from being in Betty Zane, and their behaviour here is worse than ever. Jim Gertie considerably worse than Simon. These also are based on real people. In fact, everyone pretty much is. Wetzel, it was a real person. The Gerties were real people. It would be interesting to read some history around this to see quite how romanticised these books are. I suspect very. However, we have returning characters here. Colonel Zane is back. Betty Zane is back, although she is now Mrs. Clark. Jonathan and Isaac Zane, they are all return in very much the same capacity. But Fort Henry, the settlement, is more of a backdrop to certain scenes here rather than the focus of all of the action. The story here centres on two new arrivals on the frontier who have travelled there for different reasons. Joe is after adventure. He has caught what they call on the frontier border fever. He wants to become a hunter, and Wetzel takes him under his wing and teaches him how to track and how to hunt. His brother Jim has come to the border to evangelize. He is spreading the word of Christianity to the Native American tribes and is joining a mission some way away from Fort Henry to do just that. This seems like a thankless task. They have some converts, but they have some stiff opposition as well, not least stirred up by the Gertie brothers, who know that a converted Christian Native American population cannot be exploited. Whilst the likes of Colonel Zane have their misgivings about the whole idea and don't think that it will happen just in general, the Gerties are taking action to stop the proselytizing happening. The other missionaries in this sort of semi-permanent camp that has been created come across as well-meaning but utterly unadapted for the circumstances they find themselves in. Jim has travelled there with Mr. Wells, who is rather elderly, and he has brought his two nieces along who provide the love interest. Nell, one of those nieces, is seen as a great beauty. She catches the eye of Joe and they have a bit of a flirty relationship, but she then becomes taken with Jim. This does cause a little bit of friction between the brothers, but Joe, who wants to emulate Wetzel, thinks that he also ought to emulate that character trait and not bother himself with women. That doesn't last long, but that's the intention. This book, in general, is a far bloodier affair than Betty Zane was. It does deal with the depiction of a real-life event, I'll get this right, the Nauden massacre, where close to 100 Moravian Indian Christian converts were massacred. Reality does differ from this novel in this respect, because I did read up a little bit about this. In the novel, Jim Gertie convinces the Native American tribal chiefs to carry out the massacre, and a contingent of US militiamen who have turned up at the same time decide to stand back and observe, not get involved for fear of sparking a larger conflict. The historical accounts of this massacre show that the killings were orchestrated and carried out by the US militiamen. In the novel, there are 80 of these militiamen, and they feel they can't do anything against the numbers that they'll be facing. In the real event, there were 160 of them, and they were the ones doing it. None of this is in the novel. What's also not in the novel is the fact that these US militiamen got drunk on the communion wine held by this Christian community, then raped the women and the girls, and then killed everybody. What the book instead decides to do is always make the Brits the bad guys. There are a lot more romance plots going on in this second book of the trilogy, and another Indian princess who saves the life of a frontiersman, in this case Joe. The Indian princess, who has become a Christian convert, rescues Joe, and they make their escape from the Native American camp, the evil influence in that camp being the Gertie brothers. Before they make their escape, they attempt to also rescue the other niece of Mr. Wells, who has been kidnapped, but she has been killed. I don't want to give all of the plot away, but I think the important thing that happens towards the end of this book is that Wetzel, who has been built into this superhuman, immensely powerful, single-minded, determined killer, shows some nuance, some compassion, some mercy for the first time. Not much, but enough to give a Native American chief a head start in making an escape from him. The last book of the trilogy, The Last Trail, I think came out in 1907. Again, there is romance in the air. Again, there is plotting. But the bad guys this time are more squarely just white thieves. There are Native Americans. They are on both sides of this conflict now. They are certainly not the big bad guys that they have been portrayed as in the first two books. Although you'd have to say the way the book is reaching its conclusion, this is largely because they've been forced out in great numbers. They're not less of a threat because their attitudes have changed. It's just that the frontiersmen have won. This is seen as a kind of triumph in the book, and it allows Jonathan Zane, who has been with Wetzel, not quite as good as Wetzel, but a brilliant frontiersman, allows him to think about hanging up his rifle and settling down. The frontier has been won. All this does, in reality, is open up room for further expansion. And we're going to go through this with quite a few of these Zane Grey books, I should imagine. It's that next part of the expansion, which is the Great Plains, the Wild West. It is that next phase of expansion that we think of as the Western. These have not been Westerns, they are proto-Westerns, but there are just great differences. There's no train service. There's no revolvers. One of the reasons these books are so bloody is that any close-up combat happens with knives and machetes. Any ranged combat is either the bows and arrows of the Native Americans or the muskets, which take a long time to load, the rifles that the frontiersmen use. Occasionally there might be a cannon, but not often. Don't get me wrong, these are still recognisably Westerns, but more in their approach than what they're actually describing. People are still on horses. They're still wearing buckskin, but there are no stagecoaches. There are no great caravans going west. Now there's a lot of time between revolutionary American Revolutionary War and post-US Civil War to contend with. There was also a lot of time between 1907, Spirit of the Border, and 1937, Fighting Caravans, to get to, and a lot of Zane Grey in the middle, which is why I want to read it. But at the end of the Spirit of the Border, there's almost a kind of wistful note. It's almost elegiac in its final moments, and this is helped by the fact that Zane Grey, you can see him in this trilogy becoming a better writer. He really does put you into the environment. His writing about nature isn't overly verbose, but gives you just enough sense of where you are to really picture yourself there. It'd be interesting to see how he deals with the newer environments that the journey west is going to take him. Having said all that, the next video I'll be doing is going to be about baseball, so let's change gear quite dramatically. Until next time.